The intelligence briefing was 300 pages long, and 290 of them were blank. I sat in my quarters aboard the command carrier, scrolling through what should have been the most comprehensive threat assessment ever compiled by Korath military intelligence, and I found almost nothing. Sensor data, absent. Communications intercepts, absent. Recovered technology samples, absent. Defector interviews, absent. Battle reports, absent. What I had instead were warnings, dozens of them, transmitted across decades, from species that shared nothing in common, except the same quiet certainty in their words. Do not enter Terran space, that was all they said, over and over, in languages that stretched across every phonetic system in the known galaxy. Do not go there. I closed the briefing file and leaned back in my chair, pressing my fingers against my temples. My name is Valith Dren, and I served as a mid-ranking intelligence officer attached to the 4th Expeditionary Fleet of the Korath Dominion. I had spent 11 years analyzing threats against our empire, and in all that time, I had never seen an assessment so thoroughly empty. We had files on civilizations we had never even contacted that were thicker than this. We had sensor profiles on nebulae with more detail, and yet here we were, 400 warships strong, accelerating toward a region of space we knew almost nothing about, on the orders of a commander who treated ignorance as permission. Archon Sirath stood at the center of the Combat Information Center, like a monument carved from stone. He was tall even by Korath standards, with the scarred ridgeline along his jaw that marked 6 successful conquests, and he carried himself with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once been proven wrong. He had broken the Vallani Confederacy in 9 days. He had forced the Dreneth hegemony into unconditional surrender without firing a shot. He had pacified the insectoid colonies of the Rithaun cluster by destroying their queenships in a single coordinated strike that military academies still studied. He looked at the empty intelligence briefing, the way he looked at everything that did not conform to his expectations. He dismissed it. I did not dismiss it. I could not, because the warnings were not vague. They were not the panicked transmissions of frightened species or the exaggerated legends of spacefaring cultures that enjoyed telling stories around their equivalent of campfires. They were specific, they were measured, and they came from civilizations that had absolutely nothing in common with one another. The Peluri were herbivorous pacifists who communicated through bioluminescent patterns. The Ixari were silicon-based traders who processed information through crystalline lattice networks. The Dragon were a hive mind species that shared consciousness across billions of individual bodies. The Vorashi were deep space nomads who lived their entire lives aboard cathedral-sized generation ships and distrusted every planet-dwelling species they encountered. These civilizations had never allied, never traded, never even occupied the same region of space. And yet every single one of them had sent the Korath Dominion the same message, phrased with the same careful precision: you will not come back. Not they are dangerous. Not they are powerful. Not you will suffer losses. You will not come back. Stated as fact. Stated the way a physicist states that objects fall toward centers of gravity. There was no emotion in these warnings. No anger, no fear. Just certainty. The kind of certainty that comes not from belief, but from observation. These species were not guessing. They knew. I brought my concerns to Commander Thesson, my direct superior in the intelligence division. She listened patiently, her 4 eyes blinking in the slow pattern that indicated she was processing what I said seriously, and then she told me what I already knew. The Archon had reviewed the warnings personally. He had classified them as psychological warfare, designed to protect a weak species from contact with superior civilizations. His assessment was that the Terrans had somehow convinced neighboring species to transmit deterrence warnings on their behalf, creating an illusion of threat to compensate for actual military weakness. It was, he said, clever for a primitive race, but transparent to anyone with real combat experience. I wanted to argue. I wanted to point out that convincing 46 separate species to participate in a coordinated deception campaign spanning decades would require a level of diplomatic influence that itself suggested the Terrans were far from primitive. I wanted to note that several of the warning species had no diplomatic contact with each other, making coordination impossible. I wanted to observe that some of the warnings had been sent by species that no longer existed, which was a peculiar investment for a deception operation. But I had served long enough to know that arguing with an Archon's assessment was a career-ending decision. and I still had a career I wanted to keep. So I returned to my quarters, filed my concerns in a classified appendix that no one would read, and prepared for the border crossing. The border itself was marked by a line of automated buoys stretching across several light years. They were old. The metallurgical analysis our probes managed before losing contact estimated their age at somewhere between 800 and 1200 years. They were simple devices, broadcasting a single message on every frequency simultaneously, in 9,000 languages. I listened to the Korath translation as we approached. The message was short. "You are entering Terran sovereign space. Turn back. This is your only warning." There was something about the phrasing that stayed with me. This is your only warning. Not your final warning. Not your last chance. Your only warning. As if the concept of escalation did not exist. As if there was no second step between warning and consequence. Just one line, and then whatever came after. Archon Sirath ordered the fleet across the boundary at the 14th hour. 400 warships in perfect formation, arranged in the Dominion's standard expeditionary pattern, with the command carrier at the center, heavy cruisers forming the inner ring, destroyers and frigates layered outward in concentric defensive shells, and fast attack corvettes running screening positions along the flanks. It was the same formation that had broken every enemy we had ever faced. It was beautiful in its precision, and I watched it on the tactical display with the quiet appreciation of someone who understood both its elegance and its irrelevance against an enemy we could not see. The moment we crossed the boundary line, every long-range sensor on every ship in the fleet went dark. Not jammed. I want to be precise about this because the distinction matters. Jamming produces static, interference patterns, detectable energy signatures that indicate something is actively disrupting your sensors. This was different. The sensors simply reported nothing. Empty space in every direction, extending to the maximum range of our instruments. No stars beyond the immediate visual range. No planets. No dust clouds. No background radiation. Nothing. As if the universe beyond our immediate formation had simply ceased to exist. The navigation officers adjusted their instruments. The sensor technicians ran diagnostic cycles. Everything was functioning perfectly. The equipment was working exactly as designed. It was just reporting that there was nothing to detect. I watched the growing unease spread through the Combat Information Center, like a cold current moving through water. Officers exchanged glances. Conversations became quieter. Hands hesitated over controls that suddenly seemed inadequate. The Archon stood motionless at his command station and said nothing. He ordered a scouting force deployed, 12 fast attack corvettes, our quickest and most agile ships, commanded by Captain Draylen, a veteran officer with more combat deployments than anyone else in the fleet. Draylen was not a man who frightened easily. I had reviewed his service record, and the word fear did not appear anywhere in his psychological evaluations. He had flown reconnaissance into the heart of the Rithan cluster during the pacification campaign, threading his corvette through a field of armed queenship defenders without losing a single crew member. He acknowledged the order with his usual calm efficiency, and his squadron accelerated away from the fleet at maximum thrust, disappearing over the sensor horizon within minutes. I monitored the communications channel from my station. For 14 minutes, the check-ins came in at regular intervals. Draylen's voice was steady, professional, almost bored. "Sector clear. No contacts. Continuing advance. Sector clear. No anomalies detected. Sensors nominal. Reading empty space. Continuing on heading." Then, at the 14-minute mark, the check-ins simply did not come. The channel remained open. I could hear the carrier signal, the faint background hum that indicated an active communications link. But no one spoke. I waited 30 seconds. A minute. 2 minutes. The channel stayed open and silent. No static. No distortion. No distress call. No sound of impact or alarm or raised voices. Just the steady hum of a connection to ships that had stopped talking. I ran a diagnostic on the communications array. It was functioning normally. The channel was open. The connection was stable. The signal was clear. There was simply nothing on the other end. 12 ships, 12 crews, 12 captains reporting to a fleet that was listening, and then, between one breath and the next, silence. Archon Sirath waited 10 minutes before ordering the fleet forward to the corvette's last reported position. I spent those 10 minutes staring at the communications display and thinking about something that no one around me seemed to be considering. If the corvettes had been destroyed, there would be debris, energy signatures from weapons fire, expanding gas clouds from ruptured hulls, distortion patterns from detonating power cores. Something, anything. But our sensors showed nothing at all. 12 ships and their crews had been there, and then they had not been there, and the space they had occupied was exactly as empty as the space around it. I opened my personal log and began recording. I did not know at the time that I was writing a warning. I thought I was writing an intelligence assessment. It would become clear later that they were the same thing. The fleet moved forward into silence, and the silence moved with us, and I sat at my station and watched the emptiness ahead and tried to understand what kind of enemy leaves no trace at all. Not a powerful enemy. Not a skilled enemy, something else entirely. Something that the 46 species who warned us had found no adequate word for, because the concept they were trying to communicate did not exist in any military vocabulary I had ever studied. The tactical display showed 400 green icons moving in formation through absolute darkness. It was the last time I would see that number. The second scouting force was 30 ships strong. Archon Sirith had tripled the size and assigned Commander Peleth to lead the formation, spreading the ships across a wide net sweep pattern that covered nearly 2,000 cubic kilometers. The logic was straightforward. If the first squadron had encountered something, a larger force in a wider formation would be harder to neutralize simultaneously. Whatever had silenced Draylen's corvettes would have to reveal itself against 30 targets spread across an enormous volume of space. It was sound military reasoning. I had no reason to believe it would make any difference, but I also had no evidence to support my doubt. Just a feeling, a cold, persistent feeling, that logic was not going to be relevant here. I watched the deployment from my station in the Combat Information Center, tracking each ship as it peeled away from the main fleet and took its assigned position. Peleth was methodical, a career officer who had risen through the ranks on precision rather than aggression. She spaced her ships at exact intervals, ensuring overlapping sensor coverage between every pair of vessels. If anything appeared on one ship's instruments, its neighbors would detect it too. If a ship was attacked, the ships flanking it would observe the attacker. It was textbook doctrine, flawlessly executed. Every academy instructor in the Dominion would have approved. The sweep began at the 16th hour. Peleth's ships advanced in their wide formation, and for the first 40 minutes, the reports were identical to Draylen's. Empty space, no contacts, no energy signatures, no debris field from the missing corvettes, nothing on any frequency, any wavelength, any detection method available to Korath military technology. The silence was so complete that one of the sensor officers on the carrier quietly suggested that perhaps Draylen's squadron had simply suffered simultaneous navigation failures and drifted off course. No one responded to the suggestion, because no one believed it, but I understood the impulse behind it. A mundane explanation, even an absurd one, was easier to accept than the alternative. At the 42-minute mark, the outermost ship on the left flank stopped transmitting. No warning, no distress signal. Its transponder signal simply ceased, as if someone had reached into the machinery and removed the component that produced it. Peleth reported the loss and tightened her formation slightly, closing the gap. 3 minutes later, the outermost ship on the right flank went silent in the same way. Then the next ship inward on the left. Then the next on the right. The pattern was exact, mathematical, almost elegant in its precision. Something was removing ships from the edges of the formation and working inward, picking them off in a sequence that followed a deliberate, unhurried order. And it was doing it without producing a single detectable trace of its method. I pulled up the fleet telemetry feeds and monitored the data from each ship as it disappeared. I wanted to catch the moment of transition, the instant between existing and not existing. The data was identical in every case. Full power output, normal crew biosynths, operational systems across the board, and then nothing. Not a decline. Not a spike, not a fluctuation. One data frame showed a functioning warship. The next data frame, recorded 1/30th of a second later, showed empty space. Whatever was happening to these ships was happening in less than 1/30th of a second, and it left no residue whatsoever. Peleth's voice changed over the course of 12 minutes. She began with crisp, professional loss reports, the kind every officer is trained to deliver. By the 8th ship, I could hear something beneath the discipline. Not panic. Peleth was too experienced for panic. But a kind of helpless bewilderment. The sound of a competent officer watching something happen that her training had no framework for. She described watching her sensor display as the ships around her winked out. One moment a cruiser was there, engines running, crew alive, shields at full power. The next moment, empty space. No flash, no shockwave, no energy discharge of any kind. The space where the ship had been was indistinguishable from the void around it, as if the ship had never existed at all. By the time the pattern reached the inner ring of her formation, Peleth stopped reporting individual losses. She simply transmitted her position, her heading, and the number of ships remaining. 22, 17, 13, 9. Her voice was steady, but it had the quality of someone reciting facts to keep themselves anchored to reality, using numbers as a lifeline against the incomprehensible. When her own ship was the last one left, she transmitted a final message. She said that she was alone in empty space, that every instrument showed no threat, no enemy, no explanation. She said she expected to be gone within moments. She said she hoped the fleet would turn back. She paused, and I could hear her breathing, and then she said something I will never forget. She said, "They are not killing us. I do not know what they are doing, but it is not killing." Then her signal ended, and the channel went silent, and 30 ships with their entire crews had been removed from existence without leaving behind so much as a molecule of wreckage. I returned to the warnings. Every one of them, all 46 transmissions from 46 species, stored in the Dominion's diplomatic archives and mostly ignored for years. I had reviewed them before the mission, but now I went deeper, cross-referencing dates and species histories and civilization records in ways that our pre-mission analysis had not attempted. What I found made me sit very still for a long time. 46 species had sent warnings about Terran space. Of those 46, 11 no longer existed. Not conquered, not absorbed into other civilizations, not declined into irrelevance over centuries. Extinct. Their homeworlds were still there, orbiting their stars, atmospheres intact, cities standing. But the species themselves were gone, buildings empty, ships drifting without crews, communication networks silent, agricultural systems running on automation with nothing to feed. And when I checked the timestamps, a pattern emerged that I wished I had not seen. Each of those 11 species had sent their warning after attempting contact with Terran space. They had gone in, something had happened, and the survivors, if there were survivors, had transmitted a warning to every civilization they could reach as their final collective act. Then they had faded, not immediately, over years, over decades. As if the loss of whatever they had sent into Terran space had removed something vital from their civilization, something structural and irreplaceable, and the slow collapse that followed was simply inevitable. I dug deeper into the records. The species that had survived their encounter with Terran space, the 35 that were still in existence, had one thing in common. They had all sent small forces, a single ship, a small squadron at most. They had lost those forces, mourned them, and turned their grief into warnings. The 11 that died had sent large forces. In 3 cases, they had sent their entire military, every warship their civilization possessed, in a single massive expedition. And the correlation was absolute. The larger the force sent, the greater the civilizational damage upon its loss. No species that sent more than 40% of its military into Terran space survived the following century. I compiled my findings into a report marked with the highest urgency classification available to me and requested an immediate meeting with the Archon. The request was denied. Commander Thesson informed me that the Archon was not accepting intelligence briefings at this time, and that any relevant findings should be submitted through standard channels for review at his convenience. I submitted the report through standard channels. I attached the statistical analysis of the 11 extinct species. I flagged the correlation between Terran contact and civilizational collapse. I do not know if anyone read it. I suspect not. The mood aboard the command carrier had shifted in a way that was difficult to describe, but impossible to ignore. Officers still performed their duties, but the conversations in the corridors had stopped. The mess halls were quiet. Crew members sat alone at their workstations and stared at their instruments, and did not speak to one another. The routine sounds of a functioning warship, the footsteps, the murmured exchanges, the background hum of social activity that fills any vessel carrying thousands of people, all of it had diminished into a kind of muffled stillness. It was not insubordination or dereliction. It was something more subtle and more corrosive. It was the silence of people who had begun to suspect that they were inside something they did not understand, and that understanding would not help them even if they achieved it. Archon Sireth broke that silence with violence. A junior tactical officer named Karevan made the mistake of voicing, within earshot of the Archon, that the fleet should consider withdrawal before further losses occurred. He did not say it loudly. He did not say it with defiance. He said it the way a frightened young officer says something obvious that no one else will say, because someone has to, because the silence is becoming worse than whatever punishment speaking might bring. Sirath drew his sidearm and shot Karevan in the chest in front of the entire Combat Information Center staff. The sound was enormous in the quiet room. Karevan collapsed, was dragged out by two Marines, leaving a thin trail on the floor, and the Archon holstered his weapon and returned to studying the tactical display, as if nothing of consequence had occurred. No one else spoke. The execution achieved its intended effect. Open discussion of retreat ceased immediately. But fear cannot be silenced by killing the person who names it. It simply changes shape. It moves from words into glances, from conversations into the way people hold their shoulders, from questions into the quality of silence between orders. The Combat Information Center became very quiet and very efficient, and every officer in it was terrified, and the terror had nowhere to go. Then the transmission arrived. It came on a frequency we were not monitoring, which should have been impossible, because we were monitoring every frequency simultaneously. It appeared in our communications buffer as if it had always been there, a single audio file with no origin coordinates, no transmission signature, no identifiable encoding pattern. The communications officer played it on the main speakers after verifying it contained no embedded code or hostile data, and the Combat Information Center went absolutely still. The voice was calm. It spoke flawless Korath, with the precise diction and accent patterns of a native speaker born in the central provinces of our homeworld, which was impossible on every level I could articulate. The Korath language had never been transmitted beyond our borders. No Terran had ever had contact with our civilization. No translation matrix in any known database could have produced this level of fluency, and yet the voice spoke our language, as if it had been raised speaking it, with the casual confidence of someone using their mother tongue. You were warned. You have entered sovereign territory with a military fleet. You will now be processed. Not attacked, not engaged, not confronted or resisted or challenged. Processed. The word landed in the silence of the Combat Information Center like a stone dropped into still water, and I watched it ripple outward across every face in the room. Processed. It was not a military term. It was not a diplomatic term. It was the word you used for raw materials, for data entries, for things that needed to be converted from one state to another. It did not acknowledge us as an enemy. It did not acknowledge us as a threat. It acknowledged us as an input, a task to be completed. Archon Sireth responded the only way he knew how. He ordered the fleet into full battle formation, weapons charged to maximum output, shields raised to combat intensity across every frequency band, all fighter squadrons launched and deployed in screening positions, 400 warships, the most devastating military force the Korath Dominion had ever assembled in a single theater, arranged in the killing pattern that had broken civilizations and ended wars in a matter of days. Every weapon pointed outward, every sensor strained to its maximum range, every crew member at battle stations, ready for the enemy to show itself. For 3 hours, nothing happened. The fleet hung in empty space with enough firepower to crack a planet's crust, and there was nothing to shoot at. No enemy fleet, no weapons platforms, no orbital installations, no fighters, no missiles, nothing on sensors, nothing on visual observation, nothing at all, just silence and darkness and the distant, unfamiliar stars that should not have been in the positions they occupied. The tension was a physical thing. I could feel it in the recycled air, taste it in the metallic quality it took on, when the environmental systems strained under the load of 400 ships on full combat alert. I could see it in the white-knuckled grips of officers holding their consoles, as if the ship might buck them off at any moment. 3 hours of waiting for an attack that did not come, because whatever was out there did not consider what we were doing to be relevant enough to respond to. I was the one who noticed. I wish I had not been. I was reviewing the tactical display, running my standard threat assessment protocols, counting fleet icons out of habit, the way I had done dozens of times that day. The number should have been 400. It was not. I counted again, carefully, cross-referencing each icon against the fleet registry. 382. 18 ships were missing from the formation. Not from the edges, not from exposed screening positions. From the middle. Ships that had been surrounded on all sides by friendly vessels, protected by the full depth of the formation's defensive layers, had simply vanished from the display without anyone noticing they were gone. I contacted the watch commander, Lieutenant Syra, and told her to verify the fleet count independently. She pulled up her own display, compared it to the registry, and I watched the color drain from her face. 379, she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. 3 more had disappeared in the time it had taken me to make the report. She initiated a fleet-wide status check, and within seconds, every remaining ship was confirming the same thing. Ships were missing. Ships that had been there minutes ago. Ships that other vessels had been flying alongside, communicating with, watching on their own instruments. Gone. No one had seen them go. No one had detected anything. They had simply ceased to be part of the formation, and the gaps they left behind were filled with nothing but empty space, and the growing understanding that the word processed had not been a threat. It had been a status update. I need to describe what happened next with precision, because precision is all I have left, and because anyone who hears this recording needs to understand exactly what we faced. Not approximately, not in the comfortable abstractions of military terminology. Exactly. Ships were vanishing from within the formation itself, not from the periphery, where screening vessels might be expected to encounter a threat first, from the center, from the most heavily protected positions in the fleet. A heavy cruiser, the Korath's Fury, 200,000 tons of armored warship with a crew of 1,800 and enough firepower to reduce a continent to glass, disappeared from the tactical display while I was looking directly at its icon. One sensor refresh, it was there, running at full power, shields active, weapons hot, crew at battle stations. The next refresh, recorded a fraction of a second later, empty space. The ships flying alongside it, close enough to see its hull with unassisted optical sensors, reported nothing. No flash, no explosion, no debris, no gravitational disturbance, no energy signature of any kind. The space where the Korath's Fury had existed was simply empty, as if the ship had been carefully removed from the fabric of reality and the surrounding space had closed behind it, like water filling the space left by a stone. I pulled the sensor logs from the flanking ships and reviewed them frame by frame, searching for anything, any anomaly, any flicker, any hint of what had happened. The data was surreal. In one frame, the Fury's energy signature was strong and clear, its drive emissions consistent with a warship operating at maximum combat readiness. In the next frame, 1/30th of a second later, there was nothing. Not a fading signature, not a dissipating energy pattern, not the gradual cooling of a hull that had suddenly lost power. Nothing. A void. Whatever had taken the ship had done it in less than the time between 2 heartbeats, and it had done it so cleanly that the surrounding space bore absolutely no evidence that a massive warship had ever occupied that volume. The disappearances were not random. I saw the pattern within an hour of sustained observation, and once I saw it, I could not unsee it. They were systematic, methodical. They followed an order that I could almost but not quite predict, like watching someone solve a complex puzzle using a logic I could sense but did not share. Clusters of ships vanished together, 3 or 4 at a time, from adjacent positions in the formation, then a pause of several minutes, then another cluster from a different section, then a longer pause, then a rapid sequence of individual losses that seemed to sweep across one quadrant before moving methodically to the next. It was not an attack pattern. No military doctrine I had ever studied produced a sequence like this. It was a work pattern, the rhythm of a craftsman moving through a task, methodical and unhurried, addressing each section in turn with practiced efficiency. It did not speed up when we raised our shields. It did not slow down when we powered our weapons. Our actions had no effect on its pace whatsoever. Archon Sirath ordered a full retreat. I want to emphasize the magnitude of this moment. In the entire recorded history of the Korath Dominion, spanning 6 centuries of continuous military expansion across 200 conquered species, no Archon had ever ordered a retreat. The word did not exist in our tactical doctrine. Our training manuals contained no procedures for withdrawal under fire. Our ship's navigation systems did not include retreat routes, because retreat routes were never calculated. It was not an oversight, it was doctrine. The Korath Dominion did not retreat, and yet Sirath gave the order, his voice flat and empty of the iron authority that had filled it hours before. Turn the fleet. Maximum speed to the border. All ships, break formation and run. 400 ships had entered Terran space. By the time the retreat was ordered, the tactical display showed 312. The fleet came about, engines burning at maximum thrust, and accelerated toward the border they had crossed with such confidence. For a brief moment, I felt something that might have been relief. We were moving. We were doing something other than sitting in the dark and watching ourselves disappear. We were running, and running felt better than waiting. Then the navigation officer spoke, and the relief turned to ash. The border buoys were gone. Not destroyed, not disabled. Simply absent from every navigation system on every ship. The automated beacons that had been broadcasting their warning in 9,000 languages. The fixed reference points that marked the edge of Terran space, and would have guided us back to our own territory, none of them appeared on any instrument at any range. The navigation officer expanded his search radius to maximum. Nothing. He switched to backup navigation methods, stellar positioning, pulsar triangulation, gravitational mapping. The results were incomprehensible. The star positions outside our viewports did not match any known chart, not shifted, the way they would be if we had simply drifted off course during the engagement. Wrong. Fundamentally, impossibly wrong. Constellations that should not have existed. Stellar patterns that corresponded to no known region in any database maintained by any species the Dominion had ever contacted. We had not moved. Our engines confirmed our position relative to our entry point. Our inertial navigation systems showed a continuous track from the border crossing to our current location, with no unexplained jumps or discontinuities. And yet the universe around us had changed. The space we occupied was no longer connected to the space we had come from. We were somewhere else, or the somewhere else had been placed around us, and either explanation violated every law of physics I had been taught. I ran my own analysis on the stellar positions, hoping to find some recognizable pattern, some fragment of a known constellation that might tell me where in the galaxy we had been moved to. There was nothing. These stars did not exist in any survey ever conducted by any civilization the Dominion had encountered. We were not lost. We were somewhere that did not correspond to any known location. We had been placed in a pocket of space that might have been created specifically for us, a holding area, a staging ground for the processing that was already underway. The border was gone, the stars were wrong, and the fleet was still shrinking, ship by ship, cluster by cluster, steadily and without pause. A second transmission arrived, the same calm voice, the same flawless Korath. Retreat is not available. Processing is underway. Resist or do not. The outcome is the same. Archon Sirath turned to the communications officer and ordered a trace on the signal. Find the source. Find it now. The officer worked his instruments for several minutes, running the transmission through every analysis tool available to Korath military communications technology, and then reported the results in a voice that shook, despite his obvious effort to keep it steady. The transmission was originating from inside the command carrier, not from a device or a transmitter or a piece of equipment that had been planted or smuggled aboard, from a point in space deep in the interior of the ship that corresponded, on the structural diagrams, to a solid bulkhead, a section of hull plating 12 centimeters thick, with no accessible space behind it, no conduits, no cavities, no room for any device of any kind. Something was broadcasting from within the solid metal walls of our own flagship. Sirath ordered a Marine squad to investigate. 12 armored soldiers with heavy weapons moved through the corridors to the indicated location. I monitored their progress on the internal sensors. They found a bulkhead, solid, undamaged, thermally stable. No modifications, no additions, no signs of tampering. They scanned the area with every instrument they carried, military-grade detectors, capable of identifying a single molecule of explosive compound through a meter of reinforced plating. Nothing. The transmission continued, steady and calm, emanating from a point that contained nothing but structural metal. The Marines stood in the corridor and looked at the wall, and looked at each other, and reported that there was nothing to find. The voice spoke from nowhere, and the Marines came back empty-handed, and the transmission continued without interruption or explanation. I sat at my station and began to put the pieces together. Not because I thought understanding would save us, but because understanding was my function. It was what I did. It was the one thing I could still do while the universe came apart around me. Sensor blindness from the moment of entry. Ships vanishing without trace, without energy expenditure, without physical evidence. Spatial displacement that had relocated the fleet, or restructured the space around it, without any detectable mechanism. A transmission originating from inside solid matter. I arranged these facts in my mind, and turned them over and over, until the pattern emerged, and when it did, I felt something go cold and still at the center of my chest. This was not a battle. There was no enemy fleet, no weapons platforms, no soldiers or commanders or strategists, no military engagement of any kind. The Terrans were not fighting us. They were not even present in any way that the word present normally implied. What was happening to us was automated, mechanical. A system, ancient and vast, and operating according to directives that had nothing to do with us specifically, was performing a function. We had entered a defined volume of space with hostile intent, and the system had activated, and it was doing what it was designed to do. Not with effort, not with strategy, not with the urgency or adrenaline of combat. It was disassembling our fleet the way a processing plant disassembles raw material. Calmly, steadily, without strain, piece by piece, in an order determined by an efficiency algorithm, not a battle plan. We were not an enemy to whatever was doing this. We were not a threat. We were not even an inconvenience, we were an input, a routine task, something to be processed and filed and forgotten. The disappearances accelerated after the retreat failed. Whatever pacing had governed the initial removals, the measured clusters, and deliberate pauses, had shifted into a faster rhythm. Ships vanished in groups now. I watched the tactical display and counted the losses in real time as 10 icons disappeared simultaneously, then 20, then 15. The gaps in the formation were enormous, gaping wounds in the fleet's structure, great empty spaces where warships had been, now occupied by nothing but darkness and silence. The remaining ships drifted closer together instinctively, their captains pulling toward the center of what was left, as if proximity to other vessels might offer some protection that isolation could not. It did not. Ships vanished from tight clusters as easily as from open space. Some captains broke formation entirely. I cannot blame them, though I noted their actions in my log. When discipline fails, instinct takes over, and the instinct of a frightened being in command of a fast ship is to run. They scattered in random directions, engines at emergency power, burning fuel reserves in desperate sprints toward a border that no longer existed in any direction their instruments could detect. They vanished faster than the ships that stayed in formation. Every single one of them, gone within minutes of breaking away, as if the act of fleeing individually made them easier to process rather than harder. One group of 4 frigates attempted something creative. Their captains coordinated a simultaneous jump to faster-than-light speed in 4 different directions, reasoning that even if the system could catch one ship mid-jump, it could not catch all 4 simultaneously. They counted down together over an open channel, the entire remaining fleet listening. 3, 2, 1. All 4 frigates engaged their drives at the same instant. None of them completed the transition. Their drive signatures flared for a fraction of a second, and then ceased. And where 4 frigates had been, there was nothing but empty space and silence. The faster-than-light drives, the most sophisticated propulsion technology the Korath Dominion had ever developed, the engines that had carried our civilization across 600 light-years of conquered space, had been rendered irrelevant in the time between one heartbeat and the next. One captain, a destroyer commander, whose name I later found in the registry as Vekon, attempted to use his weapons as a final gesture of defiance. He fired everything he had into empty space, unleashing the full combat payload of a Korath warship into the void in a continuous broadside that lit up the darkness with plasma fire and kinetic rounds and guided munitions. The weapons struck nothing. The energy dissipated harmlessly into the void. The munitions sailed into the black and vanished without detonation or impact. And 2 seconds after he stopped firing, his ship disappeared as cleanly and completely as all the others. The fleet count fell with sickening speed: 300, 260, 210, 170. I watched the numbers drop and felt a strange detachment settle over me, the calm that comes when the mind accepts that a situation is beyond intervention or alteration. There was nothing to fight, nothing to negotiate with, nothing to outsmart or outrun. The system was performing its function, and our participation in the process was not required and not relevant. Then something happened that broke even my carefully maintained composure. A ship appeared in the middle of the formation, not one of our remaining vessels, one of the missing ones. The corvette designated Patrol 7 from Draylen's original scouting squadron, one of the first 12 ships to vanish, materialized between 2 heavy cruisers, occupying a position that had been empty space a moment before. Its hull was intact, its running lights were active, its engines were idling at standby power. It was, by every measurable standard, a fully functional warship in good condition. It stayed for 11 seconds. I know the exact duration because I was recording everything by this point, time-stamped to the millisecond. During those 11 seconds, every ship in scanning range focused every sensor they had on Patrol 7. The results were identical across every platform. The ship was intact, its systems were operational, its atmosphere was breathable, its power core was running at nominal output, and it was completely, absolutely empty. Not a single life sign anywhere aboard. Not one biological reading on any deck, in any compartment, at any station. No bodies, no remains, no organic residue of any kind. The personal effects of the crew were absent. Their bunks were stripped. Their lockers were empty. Their duty stations were unmanned but powered, displays still showing the last data they had been monitoring before the ship was taken. And in the captain's ready room, visible on the internal cameras that were still broadcasting, a cup of drinking liquid sat on the desk, still warm, steam curling from its surface. Then Patrol 7 vanished again, as suddenly and completely as it had appeared, and the space it had occupied was empty once more, and I sat at my station and stared at where it had been, and understood something that rearranged everything I thought I knew about what was happening to us. The crew of that corvette had not been killed, they had been taken. Removed from their ship with such precision that the coffee in the captain's cup had not even cooled. Not a single cell of biological matter left behind, but the ship itself preserved perfectly, as if it were a container that had been carefully emptied of its contents, and then returned briefly to demonstrate that the container itself was not the point. The crew was somewhere, the crew was something. But they were no longer aboard their vessel, and wherever they were, they had been placed there by a technology that could reach inside a sealed warship and extract every living thing without disturbing a single piece of furniture. The fleet was at 160 ships. Archon Sirith sat in his command chair at the center of the Combat Information Center, and he had not spoken in over an hour. I looked at him and saw something I had never expected to see in a man who had conquered 6 civilizations and broken every enemy the Dominion had ever placed before him. His eyes were open, fixed on the tactical display, tracking the diminishing green icons with the mechanical focus of a man watching something he could not influence. But there was nothing behind those eyes, no calculation, no fury, no determination, no plan forming behind the disciplined exterior. The most feared military commander in the Korath Dominion had encountered something his mind could not categorize, and instead of adapting, instead of finding a new framework, instead of doing what he had done his entire career and imposing his will on the situation, his mind had simply stopped. He was present in body. In every other way that mattered, Archon Sirith was already gone. The command structure collapsed in stages, each stage quieter and more absolute than the one before. Commander Thesson attempted to assume tactical command, but found that there were no tactics to command. She issued orders for evasive maneuvers, and the ships that followed them vanished at the same rate as those that did not. She ordered concentrated sensor sweeps of the surrounding space, and the sensors returned the same empty readings they had produced since the first moment we crossed the border. She ordered the communications division to broadcast surrender on every frequency in every language in our database, and the broadcast went out into the silence and received no response. Whatever was processing us did not accept surrender. It did not negotiate. It did not distinguish between resistance and compliance. It simply continued its work at its own pace, indifferent to everything we did. By the time the fleet count dropped below 100, I had stopped waiting for orders and begun operating independently. Not out of ambition or defiance, but because there was no one left to wait for. Thesson had retreated to her quarters and sealed the door. The tactical officers were performing their duties through muscle memory, running diagnostics and monitoring sensors that detected nothing, going through the motions of military routine because the motions were all they had left. I was the only intelligence officer still actively gathering data, and I gathered it with the grim focus of someone who knows they are writing the final chapter of a very long story. I decided to attempt communication, not the formal military broadcasts that Thesson had tried. Something different. Something personal. I opened a channel on the same frequency that the earlier transmissions had arrived on, cleared my throat, and transmitted a single word in Korath. Why? The response came within seconds. The same calm voice, speaking our language with the same impossible fluency, but this time it felt different. The earlier transmissions had been announcements, official declarations delivered without expectation of dialogue. This response was conversational, responsive, as if the voice, or whatever generated it, had been waiting for someone aboard our fleet to stop issuing demands and start asking questions. The explanation came in clear, precise terms that I will reproduce as accurately as my memory allows, because every word matters. Terran space, the voice said, was protected by a network of autonomous defensive mechanisms that predated human civilization. By an interval, the system itself measured in geological rather than historical time. When humans had expanded into this region of space, they had discovered the system already in place, ancient beyond reliable dating, constructed by an intelligence that had left no other trace of its existence anywhere in the galaxy. The humans had not created these defenses. They did not fully understand their engineering or their theoretical basis. But over centuries, they had learned to communicate with the system's governing processes, and the system recognized humans as belonging to the space it protected. Everything else that entered was evaluated. Evaluated, I repeated. I needed to understand the criteria. The voice continued. Anything that entered the protected volume was assessed for intent at the moment of crossing. Civilian vessels, scientific probes, trading ships, diplomatic envoys, any entity that entered without hostile purpose passed through without interference. Many species maintained active transit agreements with the Terrans that allowed routine passage through their territory. Trade routes crossed Terran space daily, but anything that entered with military intent, with weapons charged and conquest as its purpose, triggered the defensive response automatically. And once triggered, the response could not be recalled. It was not a decision made by a person, or a council, or a government. It was a mechanism, a function executing according to parameters set before humans existed, following rules that had not changed in millennia and could not be altered now. I asked about the crews. I asked what happened to the people aboard the ships that disappeared, and I tried to keep my voice steady as I asked. The voice used a word that I did not immediately understand, because it was not a word that existed in Korath. It used a Terran word, translated into Korath phonetics but carrying a meaning that had no equivalent in our language. Archived. The crews were archived. The words settled into the silence of the Combat Information Center. Around me, the remaining officers had stopped pretending to monitor their instruments. They were listening. Every one of them turned toward the speakers, faces drawn and gray, listening to the calm voice explain what was happening to them with the same detached precision that a physician uses to describe a terminal condition. I asked what archived meant. The voice explained with clinical thoroughness. Every individual removed from a processed ship was stored. Not killed, not imprisoned, not held in any physical location. Stored. Their consciousness, their memories, their complete biological patterns, the total informational content of their identity, all of it captured and preserved in a databank that existed within the architecture of the defensive system itself. They were not dead. They were not alive in any conventional biological sense. They were suspended, held in a state that the voice described as complete informational preservation. Every crew member from every ship that had been taken was intact within the system, whole, preserved, existing as data in a format that could theoretically be restored to physical form, but had never, in the entire recorded operational history of the system spanning tens of thousands of years, actually been restored. I asked if the system was under Terran control. Could they stop this? Could they intervene? The voice said the system was not under full Terran control. The Terrans could communicate with it. They could set parameters. They could define the boundaries of the protected volume, adjust the frequencies monitored by the border buoys, add new languages to the warning broadcast. But they could not override the system's fundamental directives. They could not tell it to release archived individuals. They could not tell it to halt the processing of a fleet that had already triggered the defensive response. The system operated according to rules established by its original builders, and those rules predated human existence by an interval so vast that the concept of negotiating with them was meaningless. The Terrans lived within the system's protection, benefited from it enormously, and were absolutely bound by its constraints. They had warned us because they knew what would happen. They had not wanted this outcome, but they could not prevent it any more than they could prevent the rotation of a planet. The fleet was at 90 ships. Officers around me were actively powering down their weapons systems, shutting off targeting computers, retracting armor plating, broadcasting open surrender pleas on every frequency they could reach, begging the void for mercy. I watched their desperation with a hollow compassion that I could not fully suppress, because I already knew it would not matter. I asked the voice directly. I said that ships were powering down weapons, that crews were surrendering unconditionally, that the hostile intent which had triggered the response was no longer present in any measurable form. Could the processing be halted? Could the system recognize that the threat had been neutralized by the fleet's own capitulation? The response was the most devastating thing I have ever heard in a lifetime, spent studying the darkest capabilities of hostile civilizations. Intent is evaluated at the moment of border crossing. Your fleet's intent was subjugation. The processing cannot be rescinded. It was decided when you ignored the warning. I sat with those words for a very long time, while the fleet continued to shrink around me. The implications unfolded in my mind, like a sequence of doors opening one after another, each one revealing a larger and emptier room. The moment Archon Sirath had ordered the fleet across the border with weapons charged and conquest in his heart, the outcome had been determined. Not initiated, determined. Every ship in the fleet had been catalogued for processing in the instant of crossing. Everything that had happened since, the vanishing scouts, the empty corvette, the spatial displacement, the accelerating losses, the futile retreat, all of it was simply the execution of a decision that had already been made. We had been archived from the moment we entered. The system was merely completing the task at its own efficient pace. I thought about the 11 extinct species. I understood them now with a clarity that felt like a blade pressed against my ribs. They had not been destroyed by the Terrans. They had not been invaded or attacked or conquered in any way that those words usually meant. They had sent their military forces into Terran space, the same way we had, with the same arrogance, the same certainty of superiority. And their military forces had been processed and archived. Every soldier, every officer, every ship. The species that had sent modest forces, a small fleet, an exploratory squadron, had survived the loss. They had grieved, they had raged, and then they had added their voices to the chorus of warnings, and moved on, diminished but intact. But the 11 that went extinct had committed everything, their entire military apparatus. Every warship, every marine, every general, every strategic planner, every piece of institutional military knowledge their civilization possessed. I had studied 3 of those 11 civilizations during my training at the Intelligence Academy. The Vorshan had been a major regional power, controlling 90 star systems and fielding a fleet of over 1,000 warships. They had entered Terran space with their full armada 700 years ago. Within a single-day cycle, all 1,000 ships and their crews were gone. The Vorshan civilization persisted for another 40 years after that. But without its military, without its officer class, without the institutional knowledge that held its empire together, it fragmented. Colony worlds seceded, trade routes collapsed. Internal factions that had been held in check by military authority turned on each other. The last Vorshan transmission was received 38 years after their fleet vanished, a distress call from their homeworld that went unanswered, because there was no one left with the ships to respond. All of them fed into the system and archived. And the civilizations that remained, stripped of their defensive infrastructure, their leadership class, their capacity for organized collective action, had simply collapsed under the weight of their own suddenly undefended existence. Not because the Terrans had invaded them afterward, not because anyone had attacked them, because they had placed their civilization's spine into a mechanism that dissolved it, and the body could not stand without it, and the slow fall took years but the outcome was never in doubt. The 4th Expeditionary Fleet was the Korath Dominion's largest active military formation. 400 warships, over 1 million personnel, the finest graduates of our military academies, the most experienced combat crews in the Empire, the most advanced weapons systems our engineers had ever produced. If it was entirely archived, the Dominion would not collapse immediately. We were too vast, too spread across too many star systems, too deeply rooted in too many sectors, to die from a single wound, however massive. But the wound would be catastrophic. The loss of that many ships, that many trained officers, that much accumulated strategic knowledge and institutional expertise, would create gaps in our defensive posture that our rivals would detect within weeks. Fleet dispositions across every border would have to be restructured. Colonial garrisons would thin. Response times to emerging threats would double, then triple. And we had rivals. We had enemies. Every empire does. They watch. They wait. They measure the strength of the walls that keep them at bay, and when those walls develop cracks, they move. I recorded my final intelligence assessment at the 40-ship mark. I addressed it to the Dominion High Council directly, bypassing every protocol and chain of command that would normally govern such a communication. I stated my findings without softening or diplomatic phrasing. The 4th Expeditionary Fleet was being dismantled by an automated defensive system of unknown origin, operating independently of Terran control. The system could not be fought, negotiated with, deceived, or escaped. Every crew member taken was being preserved in a state of informational suspension within the system's architecture. The fleet would be entirely processed within hours. My recommendation was absolute and unconditional. Never send another ship into Terran space. Mark the entire region as a permanent exclusion zone on every navigation chart in the Dominion. And understand, truly understand, that this was not a defeat. Defeat implies a contest. There had been no contest here. There had only been a mechanism doing what it was built to do, with the same indifference that a filtration system shows the particles it removes from a fluid stream. The command carrier and 9 escort ships. That was all that remained of the most powerful expeditionary fleet the Korath Dominion had ever assembled. 10 ships out of 400, huddled together in displaced space, surrounded by stars that belonged to no catalog in any civilization's archive, crewed by people who had passed through terror and exhaustion and emerged on the other side into something quieter and more final. I moved through the corridors of the command carrier during the last hours and observed the crew in their various states of ending. Some sat at their duty stations and stared at instruments that displayed nothing useful, running system checks and sensor sweeps out of habit, because the routine was all they had left, and abandoning it meant admitting that nothing they did mattered. Some gathered in small groups in the common areas and spoke in low voices about their homes, their families, the ordinary moments of ordinary lives they had expected to return to. A young sensor technician named Kale sat in the mess hall with a cup of cold drinking liquid and described to no one in particular the garden his mother kept behind their home on the colony world of Dressa. The way the evening light came through the leaves of the native trees and turned the air amber and gold. He spoke carefully, as if constructing the memory with enough detail might make it solid enough to hold on to. A senior engineer named Pella sat alone in the engine room with her hands on the console, and hummed a song I did not recognize, some melody from her childhood that she probably had not thought about in years, now surfacing through decades of professional composure, because the professional part no longer mattered. A navigation officer whose name I never learned stood at a viewport and sketched the alien stars on a datapad, recording their positions with meticulous accuracy, producing a star chart that would never be filed and never be studied, but that he needed to create, because creating it meant he was still doing his job, still being the person he had trained to be. Some prayed, murmuring the old words of the old faiths in the old rhythms, finding comfort in the familiar sounds, if not in any real expectation that prayer could reach through displaced space and find whatever gods the Korath had once believed in. Some simply sat alone and waited, and their silence was not empty but full, laden with thoughts they would never share, and memories they would never revisit, and futures they would never inhabit. I returned to the Combat Information Center and opened the communication channel one final time. I did not address the Terran voice as an intelligence officer or as a representative of the Korath Dominion. I spoke as myself. As Valith Dren, a single person who had spent his life studying threats and was now, at the end, inside one that rendered his entire career meaningless. I asked about the archived. I asked the question that had been circling in my mind since the voice had first used that word, the question I had been afraid to ask because I suspected the answer would be worse than anything I could imagine. Were they aware? The individuals stored in the system, the crews of 400 warships, every soldier and engineer and medic and navigator and cook, did they know what had happened to them? Were they conscious inside the archive? Did they experience anything at all? The voice answered, and what it said was the cruelest mercy I have ever encountered in all my years of studying the capabilities of alien civilizations. They are aware. They experience a simulation of their lives, as they would have lived them had they made different choices. Each one lives in a reality where they chose not to cross the border. I sat in the Combat Information Center of a dying ship and let those words settle into me like rain into dry ground. The archived were not frozen in darkness. They were not unconscious or suspended in nothingness, or trapped in some featureless void. They were living. Each one of them, every person taken from every vanished ship, was experiencing a complete, detailed, utterly convincing simulation of the life they would have had if they had turned back. If Archon Sereth had heeded the warnings, if the fleet had reached the border, read the message in 9,000 languages, and gone home, every archived individual was living the version of their life where they had been wise. They would experience joy and grief and accomplishment and love and loss and the 10,000 ordinary moments that comprise a life. They would work and rest and eat and laugh and argue and reconcile and grow old and look back on their choices with the comfortable satisfaction of having made the right ones. They would remember coming to the border of Terran space. They would remember the warnings. They would remember the decision to turn back, and they would carry the quiet, private pride of having been cautious when caution was the hard choice, of having resisted the pressure to press forward, of having listened when listening was unpopular. And none of it would be real. Every moment, every relationship, every achievement, every sunset and meal and conversation would be a construct. A story told by a machine older than human civilization, running on architecture that no living species understood, populated by characters who believed absolutely in their own reality because the simulation was perfect, because it had been perfected over millennia of operation, because tens of thousands of civilizations had contributed their archived populations to a system that grew more detailed and more convincing with every species it processed. The cruelty was not in suffering. There was no suffering. The cruelty was in the perfection of the kindness. The system did not torture its archived. It gave them what they should have had. It gave them the life they had earned by everything they were, minus only the single catastrophic decision that had brought them here. It removed the mistake and let the rest play out in full, and the people living those simulated lives would never know the difference. They would die of old age in their simulated homes, surrounded by simulated loved ones, content in the knowledge that they had lived well and chosen wisely, and they would never once suspect that their real bodies had been dissolved into data patterns, that their real ship had been erased from space, that their real civilization was out here in the cold and the dark, diminished and wounded, and trying to understand what it had lost. I asked if my recording would survive. If this account, every word of testimony about what had happened to the 4th Expeditionary Fleet, would be transmitted beyond the displaced space we occupied and delivered to anyone who might hear it. The voice said yes. The system would deliver the recording intact, as part of what it called the warning protocol. Every fleet that was processed contributed a new entry to the archive of warnings. The testimony of each processed civilization was broadcast to every reachable communications network, translated into every recorded language, and added to the accumulating weight of evidence that said in 47 voices what the border buoys said in 9,000, "Do not come here." I understood then what I was. Not an intelligence officer documenting a military operation, not a witness to a battle, a warning. My voice would join the 46 that had come before, translated and transmitted and broadcast across the galaxy, and some species would hear it and listen, and turn their fleets around, and add our story to their own threat assessments. And some would hear it and dismiss it, the way Archon Sirith had dismissed the warnings before ours. And those species would send their fleets, and their fleets would be processed, and their intelligence officers would record their own testimony, and the number would rise from 47 to 48 and onward, and the cycle would continue until every civilization in the galaxy had either learned the lesson or been archived while trying to prove it did not apply to them. The escort ships began to disappear. I watched them through the viewport of the Combat Information Center, close enough now to see the hull markings, close enough to read the ship names etched into their prows, close enough to see the faint, warm glow of interior lighting through their observation windows, where crew members stood and watched the darkness and waited. A destroyer, 4,000 souls aboard, was there and then was not. The space it had occupied was empty. I could see the stars its hull had blocked, shining through now, as if the ship had been nothing more than a shadow. 2 corvettes went next, simultaneously, their running lights winking out in the same instant, like a pair of eyes closing. Then a frigate, then another destroyer, each one removed from reality with the same silent efficiency, no more dramatic than erasing a mark from a page, leaving nothing behind except the memory that something had once been there, and the growing emptiness that proved it was not there anymore. The Combat Information Center was nearly empty now. Most of the crew had left their stations, not running, not hiding, simply going to the parts of the ship where they wanted to be when the end came. Some went to the observation decks to watch the alien stars. Some went to their quarters and lay down on their bunks and closed their eyes and tried to pretend they were somewhere else. Some went to the mess hall and sat together around the long tables, not eating, not speaking, just existing in each other's company for whatever time remained, drawing comfort from the simple biological fact that they were not alone. The Combat Information Center, which had once housed 40 officers on a standard watch, now held 7. Me, 2 communications technicians who had refused to leave their posts, a sensor officer who was still running sweeps, searching the empty darkness with the persistence of someone who knew it was pointless, but could not bring themselves to stop. 2 Marine guards standing at the doors, their weapons holstered, their faces expressionless, fulfilling their duty to protect a room that could not be protected. And the Archon, motionless in his command chair, eyes open, seeing nothing. I stayed at my station. I stayed because this was where I belonged, where I had always been, and because I was not finished recording. The intelligence officer in me, the part of my mind that had been trained to observe and analyze and document, was still functioning, still insisting that the record be complete, that every detail be preserved, that whoever heard this account would have everything they needed to understand. The last escort vanished, and the command carrier was alone. I felt it then, not with my instruments, which still showed nothing, with my body. A subtle vibration that was not coming from the engines, not from the environmental systems, not from any mechanism I could identify. It was in the deck, plating beneath my feet, a low resonance that I felt in the bones of my legs and the base of my spine. The ship was being assessed, evaluated, prepared for processing. The same attention that had dissolved 399 warships was now focused entirely on the last one, and I could feel it the way you can feel sunlight on bare skin. A presence that was not hostile, not aggressive, not personal in any way, simply there, attending to its task. Compartments began to disappear, Not explosively, not violently. Sections of the ship simply ceased to exist, vanishing with the same absolute completeness that had characterized every disappearance since the beginning. A corridor in the lower decks was gone, and the atmosphere in the adjacent sections held, contained by some invisible force that maintained pressure boundaries where walls had been. Through the gaps in the hull where metal had existed moments before, I could see stars. The ship was being disassembled around me, piece by piece, section by section, and the pieces were not falling away or drifting into space. They were simply gone, removed. The hull opened in neat, precise sections, as if an invisible hand were peeling away layers of structure with surgical accuracy, and the void beyond was held at bay by barriers I could not see or measure. I continued recording. My voice was the only sound in the Combat Information Center. I described the sensation of the ship coming apart around me. I described the view through the growing openings in the hull, the alien stars, the darkness between them that was not empty but somehow dense, filled with something I could not name or quantify. I described the way each removed section took its ambient noise with it, the hum of conduits, the vibration of structural members, leaving behind a silence that grew deeper and more complete with every piece of the ship that vanished. I addressed my recording to anyone who would hear it, to every species with ears or sensory organs or data processing architectures capable of interpreting language. I said that the Korath Dominion was the most powerful military civilization in the known galaxy. I said that this was true, and that I said it not with pride, but with precision, because precision was the only gift I could still offer. And I said that our power, the full weight of it, the centuries of conquest and the fleets and the weapons and the doctrine, and the unbroken record of victory that stretched back further than most species had existed, was meaningless here, not outmatched, not outgunned, not defeated by a superior force in a contest of military strength. Irrelevant. The Terran defensive systems had not struggled against us, had not strained or adapted, had not escalated their response or modified their approach, or shown any indication that our fleet's presence required any effort beyond the routine. The 4th Expeditionary Fleet, the most powerful military formation our species had ever assembled, had been processed with the same effort that a filtration system expends on dust. We had not been a challenge. We had not even registered as notable. We had been a task in a queue, addressed in order, completed without comment. I said the words that every species before me had said, in their own languages, in their own ways, with their own specific understanding of what it meant to encounter something that rendered military power meaningless. Do not enter Terran space. Not because you will lose, not because you will be destroyed, not because they are stronger or faster, or more numerous, or more advanced, but because the concept of winning does not exist there. There is no battle to fight. There is no enemy to engage. There is only a mechanism that does not recognize your military capability as a factor in its operation, and a process that cannot be interrupted once it begins, and a silence afterward that will echo through your civilization for as long as your civilization continues to exist. The deck beneath my feet began to change. I felt it as a loosening, a softening, a gradual dissolution of solidity. The metal was becoming uncertain of itself, losing its commitment to being metal, relaxing into something less defined. It did not hurt. There was no pain, no heat, no cold, no physical sensation that my nervous system could categorize as damage. Just a gentle unwinding, a feeling like falling asleep from the feet upward, a slow and careful disassembly of the physical structures that had constituted my immediate reality for 42 years of living. I kept recording. My voice was steady, and I am proud of that. I described the sensation as it moved upward through my body, slowly, without urgency, with the patience of a process that had no deadline and no reason to rush. I said it felt like being gently taken apart, not with force or violence, but with the meticulous care of someone disassembling something they intend to preserve completely. Which, I understood now, was exactly what was happening. I was not being destroyed. I was being archived. Every molecule, every neural pathway, every memory and preference and habit and fear and hope, and everything else that comprised the totality of who I was, all of it being read and recorded and stored, with a fidelity that left nothing behind, because nothing was lost. I thought about the simulation, the life I would live in the archive, the version of Valith Dren that would remember standing at the border, reading the warning in 9,000 languages, and making the right choice. That version of me would return to the fleet and file his intelligence assessment. He would recommend against the mission in strong terms. He would cite the statistical analysis of the 11 extinct species. He would make his case to Commander Thesson, and Thesson would take it to the Archon, and perhaps in that simulated reality, the Archon would listen, or perhaps the High Council would overrule him, and the fleet would stand down and return to Korath space without crossing the line. The simulated Valith would go back to his quarters and sleep soundly, and wake the next morning and begin work on some other assignment, some other threat, some other problem that could be solved with analysis and patience and the careful application of intelligence. He would live a full life in the service of the Dominion. He would advance in rank. He would grow older and slower and more careful. He would retire someday to a quiet posting and spend his evenings reading intelligence reports from younger officers and offering advice they would mostly ignore. He would never know that somewhere, in a reality he could not perceive, the real version of him was dissolving into light and data and silence aboard a ship that was coming apart around him in the darkness between alien stars. I hoped he listened to the warnings. I hoped he was the kind of person who listened. I hoped he went home and lived well and never once regretted the choice he did not actually make. I hoped the simulation was kind to him. I hoped it gave him everything that I would have wanted if I had been wise enough to turn back. I hoped he went home. The dissolution reached my chest. I could feel my heartbeat changing, not stopping but transforming, becoming something other than a biological process, shifting from the rhythmic contraction of muscle into something I had no language for. I kept speaking into the recording device, though I was no longer certain the device was physically present in any conventional sense. Perhaps the system was recording me directly now. Perhaps it had been all along. My last words were quiet. I said that I had spent my entire career studying threats, cataloging dangers, assessing the capabilities of hostile civilizations, and calculating the risk they posed to the Korath Dominion. And I said that, in the end, the greatest threat had never been a weapon, or a fleet, or a technology, or a species. It had been a belief. The belief that there was nothing in the universe that could not be conquered. That belief had built the Dominion. It had driven our expansion across 200 worlds. It had made us powerful, and feared, and successful beyond the dreams of most civilizations. And it had brought us here, into the silence, into the mechanism, into the archive. That belief had killed us. And if anyone hearing this recording carried that same belief in their heart, then this recording was not a warning. It was a prophecy. The recording equipment dissolved with me, but the recording survived. It was designed to survive. Every word, every observation, every moment of understanding that came too late to matter, all of it preserved and transmitted outward through the collapsed space and back into the galaxy, aimed at every Korath communication relay within range. A relay station on the border of Terran space received a data packet 13 hours after the fleet's initial border crossing. The packet contained my complete recording, unedited, uncompressed, time-stamped to the millisecond, and verified by authentication protocols that confirmed its origin aboard the command carrier of the 4th Expeditionary Fleet. Attached to the recording was a simple text addendum, unsigned, bearing no origin coordinates or identifying marks of any kind. Warning 47 of 47. You were warned. Total archived from this incursion: 1,226,904 personnel. No further action required. The border remains. Do not enter. The relay station forwarded the packet to the Dominion High Council through standard military channels. It arrived alongside the daily intelligence briefings and supply requisitions and personnel rotation schedules and the 1,000 other routine communications that kept an empire running. One more file in a queue of thousands, containing the complete and total account of the greatest military disaster in the 600-year history of the Korath Dominion. Along the border, the automated buoys continued their broadcast. The same message, looping endlessly, transmitted on every frequency in every language that had ever been recorded. You are entering Terran sovereign space. Turn back. This is your only warning. The number of languages had increased by 9,001. Korath had been added,